Good afternoon, good day, depending on when you're watching this. So let's cut right to it. The big question is, how do we make geography exciting for the kids so that they sign up and take it as a school subject and ultimately turn it into a career? So that's the big question that we are hoping to address here at Rock and Sky. And so my name is Davie, and welcome. It's the 23rd of January, 1960. A submarine, but more than a submarine, a vessel called the Bathyscaphe is lowered into the sea. It's quite a rough day. The sea is blue, but the sharks are circling, and the waves are quite high, and there's been a debate going on since 2 in the morning as to whether the expedition is going to go ahead. Now, this is no ordinary expedition. Back in 1875, HMS Challenger sounded that particular portion of the ocean. And unbeknownst to them, they had sounded the deepest place on Earth. At the time, they got a reading of 8184 meters, 8 kilometers down. And so the Bathyscaphe, depends how you want to pronounce it, Trieste was lowered into the sea above what is now known as the Challenger Deep, as a nod to HMS Challenger, who first discovered. It's part of the Marianas Trench system southwest of Guam. And so they were going to go on this expedition to the bottom of this trench. So the great debate was whether they were going to go ahead with the expedition, because the sharks were circling and the weather was stormy, and there had been a discussion as to whether it was safe to put the 2 crew members on board. The Bathyscaphe Trieste had been designed by Auguste Piccard. And he was a Swiss designer, he was a Swiss explorer, and he had been building balloons that had gone up to enormous heights. He had the world record. He'd been doing research of the upper atmosphere. They'd created these pressure chambers and suspended them below balloons, and they'd gone up to amazing altitudes, measuring radiation and the structure of the upper atmosphere. And then in 1933, he went to the World Exposition in Chicago, and he met 2 Americans who were doing all sorts of experiments with deep diving equipment, and their names were Otis Barton and William Beebe. And that changed the course of Auguste Piccard's life, because then instead of going up in high balloons or up to high altitudes in balloons, he changed his focus, and then he started to devote his energies to deep sea diving. And the ultimate outcome of that was this Bathyscaphe Trieste. And then they worked with the Italians. The Italians built it. They worked with the Italians, and then the French Navy, and ultimately he sold it to the US Navy in 1958. And 2 years later, they found themselves above the Marianas Trench, and in particular the Challenger Deep. So the 2 crew members who were going to make the descent were Jacques Piccard, the son of the old man, and a submariner called Ron Walsh. And so they'd been doing a number of practice dives over the months before, and they'd made some modifications to the Trieste. But ultimately, on the day, they were moored above Challenger Deep, and debating whether to go ahead. So they climbed aboard and they shut the hatches. And now I must leave that story for a little while and talk about the Challenger Deep. We have been talking in some of my other videos about plate tectonics. So the Pacific Plate meets the Filipino Trench in the Marianas Trench, and it is essentially a subduction zone. So that a crew of HMS Challenger back in 1875 didn't realize, they had no inkling of plate tectonics. And to some extent, in 1960, plate tectonics was kind of finding some, what's the word I'm looking for? It was gaining some traction in the scientific community, but it hadn't been fully accepted. They knew it was the deepest place on Earth, but I don't think they realized that it was a subduction zone where the Pacific Plate is being destroyed as it descends below the Filipino Plate. And the islands of Guam, the island of Guam. So the island of Guam and the northern Marianas Islands are essentially an island arc, which is formed due to the volcanic activity that takes place as the Pacific Plate descends below the Filipino Plate. So it's fantastic stuff. So that's the significance of that Marianas Trench, and it is the deepest place on Earth. And Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh were locked up in this tiny little capsule on the Bathyscaphe, Trieste. They must have had second thoughts when they locked down that hatch, because they were going down nearly 11 kilometers. 10,929 meters. Apologies for the birds. The descent was going to be 10,929 meters, nearly 11 kilometers. If we drop Mount Everest into the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and the Challenger Deep in particular, there's still going to be 2,000 meters of water between the surface of the ocean and the summit of Mount Everest. So it's massively deep. Huge, huge water pressures. So Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh shut that hatch, and with a certain degree of fear and trepidation and excitement started to make their descent. It took them 4 hours and 45 minutes to get to the floor of the trench. At 9,000 meters, I've got to take my hat off to these guys, there was an enormous bang which shook the whole ship, the Bathyscaphe. And this is where it showed their real mettle. Because they carried on with the descent. There was a crack in the plexiglass window. But they looked at all their gauges and they thought, you know what, things look okay, and they carried on going. So they had almost another 2 kilometers to go. And they carried on. And they got to the bottom, and they looked out that tiny little porthole, that little window out onto a dark, cold, hostile world. They claim to have seen soles and flatfish, but that has been disputed. They claimed that they saw foraminifera, which is a very tiny little animal made of silica that settles out to the ocean floor. I'm not sure how long they were down there for, but they didn't stay there for very long, and then they started their ascent. And that must have been quite a relief. So up they went. It was 4 degrees. The water temperature is on average 4 degrees out there. So that Bathyscaphe was freezing cold inside. And so they kept themselves going on chocolate bars. I don't know what brand, but chocolate bars. Freezing cold in there. 2 men in this tiny little metal chamber with a cracked window. And so back they went. 3 hours and 15 minutes back to the surface. And it was afternoon when they got up into that, almost the sunset, that warm blue Pacific Ocean. It must have been the most amazing thing. But now they were famous. They were really famous. They went down not knowing if they were going to come back alive. And rest assured, if that thing had imploded, if that Bathyscaphe had imploded, they would have turned instantaneously into pink pulp. So I'm sure they were very happy when they got back to the surface. But now they were famous. The 2 men, A Swiss and an American had been all the way to the bottom of the deepest place on Earth. So I think it quite fitting that Alfred Wegener, the mad professor, who first came up with the theory of continental drift and was laughed at, he was a meteorologist, and he was laughed at by the geologists. And then a man who was exploring the upper atmosphere, a Swiss, building balloons and high-pressure chambers so that people can make ascents to these amazingly high altitudes. Also, technically a meteorologist. Then turns his hand to making a bathyscaphe, which then explores the deepest portion of the ocean, the deepest trench, the Challenger Deep. What an amazing story. And I don't think those men aboard HMS Challenger back in 1875 had any idea that they were dipping the deepest portion of the ocean. And that all those years later, what is that, 1960, 60 and another 25, 85 years later, a submersible would then, if submersible is the word, a bathyscaphe would then sound those same depths. So it's a wonderful story, a really wonderful story. I must end it there. So hats off to Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard, brave men. A collaborative effort from the Swiss and the Italians, and indirectly via the French Navy and then onto the US Navy with a great team to do this amazing thing. And when you think about it, it's, what, 60 years ago now? So the Trieste is in the museum, which you can go and have a look at. There's a fantastic video on YouTube put out by the National Geographic and Rolex. And I'm going to end my story here. But what I am doing is making a course on rocks, on plate tectonics, on weathering, but talking about these other amazing stories which brings the subject to life. So if you're interested in that, please click on the link below and you can sign up, and you'll be the first to know when we launch. Please like my video, please share my video, please give me the thumbs up. Go to the Rock and Sky Facebook group. We just love to have everybody there engaging. And send me an email if you want. The details are all below. So it's very easy. You've done this before. So we will see you on the next one. Stay tuned.